Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, Governor John Bel Edwards said that the legislature could have done better during its recently concluded special session. We'll look tonight at how well it did, as well as the performances by the governor and key legislators. We'll also examine what to expect in budget cuts and how charter school funding has fared. With the special session concluded, now comes the legislature's regular session, which opens Monday. Between the gavels, we will speculate on the presidential race and what was learned from the Louisiana primary. On the floor for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jeremy Alford, publisher, LaPolitics.com. Steve Beatty, editor, The Lens. And Tyler Bridges, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. Jump over to Jeremy, and we're going to start talking about that special session. How did it work organizationally? Did anything really productive come out of it? What are we to expect?
To quote our old friend John McGinnis, I think the legislature, especially this session, could have gotten less done, but they ran out of time. It's almost easier to look at what they didn't do as opposed to what they did do in this session. They did not pass any substantive tax reform, no budget reforms, no spending reforms. They did not completely bury the current and next fiscal year shortfalls. And, like the legislature does every time there are dire economic conditions, they turn to the penny, they turn to the sales tax. But even those changes are temporary in nature. We're going to be right where we are right now in the next few years. They're going to have to try to figure out some consistent revenue streams. They're going to have to make some spending reforms. But at the top of the heap of what's left over, we are going to see some increases in the sales tax for individuals and for businesses. Businesses are going to find themselves paying on a temporary basis more in sales taxes than they have in recent times. They're going to be paying the business utilities. They'll be paying it on machinery, manufacturing equipment. But there's also some changes I think that have been overlooked, especially on the corporate side. Businesses that are pass-through companies that elect to be identified as corporations on the federal level are going to be slapped with the corporate franchise tax. The corporate income tax rate, they're going to a flat rate that's going to go to 6.5. That's going to be additional money for businesses if they approve it in the fall. But there's higher taxes now on cigarettes, cell phones, landlines, automobile rentals, short-term hotel bookings online. There's a bill that was passed to set up a system for collecting an online sales tax eventually. So there was a lot of moving pieces, but I think that the politics was probably just as interesting as some of the legislation that was passed.
So 1 cent more on our sales tax, and that's for a duration of 27 months? Is that?
27 months.
27 months. The governor had wanted 5 years.
He did.
So he didn't get all the time that he wanted. But there was also a movement there for a while, particularly favored among the Republicans, as I understand it, to even make that a higher increase. What happened there?
Well, there was this plan to add maybe a fraction of a penny on top of the 1 cent that the governor had proposed, and to kind of drop it down going from one fiscal year to the next until eventually you're back to the 4 cent, that 4 cents that we have right now. That was a bridge too far for Democrats who felt, and the governor who felt like that would impact low income to moderate income families. There were some talks at one time about, if Republicans wanted to do that, then Democrats were asking them to increase the rates for higher income taxpayers.
But doesn't the penny still make us the highest sales tax
Absolutely.
in the nation?
Temporarily.
Mm-hmm.
For 27 months.
For 27 months.
For 27 months, yeah. So.
Are there people that are still believing that everything can be solved just by making cuts and that we don't need any additional revenue, that the problem is just with overspending?
I think there's a small handful of folks who still think that, but I think more of them who went into the session thinking that they would be able to cut their way out of a $954 million hole this fiscal year and $2 billion next year quickly came to the realization that that's just not going to happen.
But that didn't mean that they voted for the sales taxes that would close that gap.
Right. I mean, there is the no caucus, these folks who voted no, and it's a lot of lawmakers were talking after the session, especially those who voted in favor of the taxes, saying, the governor has to come back and cut some from this fiscal year, and they're hoping that he would do it strategically in the districts where lawmakers voted no for new revenue. And so, and politically that would kind of help prime the pump for the second special session we're going to have.
I've been reading reviews and opinions from the newspapers. Basically, they're not good reviews for the performance of the legislature during the special session. They were under just a very limited amount of time and had some very, very important work to do. Can you describe how did they handle this time crunch?
Well, poorly, I would say.
In a word.
In a word. These are uncharted waters, and this is a completely different political landscape than what we've seen in the past, starting with the House. It's the first time they have an independent speaker in recent history. It's the first time that there's a independent committee structure, and it is completely stacked with conservative votes. Meanwhile, you have a governor who no longer has the same sticks and carrots that his predecessors enjoyed. He can't go around doling out loads of capital outlay money, which is kind of projects to bring back home. He doesn't have control over committee assignments to get people yanked off of committees in the House. And so I think everyone's trying to find their footing, and the House has become so fractured. Even though there's a Republican majority, within the Republican delegation is fractured. You have your John Bel Edwards Republicans. You have your Republicans who are to the far right and will never vote for a tax to save their life. And meanwhile, you have just you have, I think, a speaker who wasn't fully expecting to become speaker until probably the weekend before that election. And it's all just starting to come together. And on the Senate side, of course, has always traditionally been the backstop for the governor, and it will continue to be that. But there's some bad blood between the House and the Senate. And the way it ended with the House dumping these reconciliation reports on the Senate at the last minute, that really upset Senate President John Alario and really the entire Senate. And I think the way the session ended on Wednesday night just widened that divide and the bitterness between the House and the Senate.
So these reports that you say were dumped at the last minute, I mean, generally there are some last-minute reports that come through, but not, there were 8 of them that came literally at the last minute. So that means that nobody can really take a look at what's in there.
Yeah, I was there in the Senate chamber, and just, the press sits on a table on the floor. And behind me, because I stood up and watched some of this, was all these aides were scurrying in and out, trying to get signatures. The speaker was back there with the Senate president. They were desperately trying to get all this stuff together. And the clock was ticking down.
Mm-hmm. And so, like you said, physically, people had to carry one piece of paper from one chamber to another chamber. Physically, I mean, this couldn't be done electronically. We see video literally of some of the aides.
No, they needed signatures. And as Jeremy said, they ended up approving stuff that, as we sit here now, people are still trying to figure out exactly what they approved, much less when the legislators voted on it.
And then you had a group of people who were just brand new legislators who'd only been elected a few months earlier, then all of a sudden they're in the middle of all of this.
Not even 2 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
they've been in office, and the first votes they're taking are, and a lot. There were a few of them that ran on anti-tax planks, and here we are, their first votes are on tax measures.
So this was a real baptism of fire for these folks. I want to ask you guys, I mean, we had to close, an almost $1 billion hole was $900 million for this fiscal year. How short are we?
Well, the legislature had 3 objectives, or 3 tasks. The first was to close the $950 million shortfall, and they came within maybe $30 or $50 million. And so there are going to be some pretty good cuts just from that, it looks like. Second thing they had to do is to make up most of or all of the deficit they're facing for the regular session that starts on Monday. And they started that with a $2 billion gap. Now that's down to about $800 million. Mm-hmm. The third thing they needed to do, as Jeremy mentioned, was to carry out tax reform. That can be defined different ways, but certainly the best measure of that is closing corporate loopholes and individual tax loopholes, particularly that favor one politically connected group or another. And as Jeremy said, that they passed some of the stuff, but it was just done in a temporary way. And the legislature is setting themselves up with a big fiscal cliff. The measures that they passed in the last 8 minutes mean that on June 30th, 2018, the legislature their state's going to lose over $1 billion in revenue. And so they're setting themselves up to have to take another big tax votes. At the meantime, they're short of money right now. And the legislature, at least in the special session, didn't seem to have any appetite for tax reform, closing those loopholes. They particularly on the individual side, they didn't want to make changes.
So let's talk about the personalities a little bit more that were involved in this whole special session. We have the newcomers who had to go through this baptism of fire. We have a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. How did that dynamic play out? And who would you say were some of the key players?
I think there's more of a partisan divide in this legislature than we've maybe ever seen, particularly in the House. In the House, the key players obviously starting with House Speaker Taylor Balrog, but what he has are usually speakers we see. They have a variety of lieutenants. They got their Cajun lieutenant, they got their North Louisiana lieutenant, someone from the Black Caucus, and they can send them out. And but what Taylor Balrog seems to have is two key lieutenants in Lance Harris, the Republican delegation chair, who really seems like he worked more as a whip than a caucus chairman this session, and then Appropriations Chairman Cameron Henry, who was supposed to be kind of the numbers guy for the team. And there were a lot of problems between the governor and that team. He actually, in a press conference, criticized the House Speaker, blamed the House for the lack of progress. They responded by tanking one of his bills and calling it a night when they did that. But there's definitely some strong personalities in the Senate as well.
And speaking about the strong personalities, and we look to John Alario really just to keep things moving along, and he was quite emotional as things came to an end. Yeah,
it was a remarkable scene there in the Senate. Again, they came from within about 3 minutes of not passing the final tax bill. You may not like the tax bill if you're on the tax side, but it was going to mean such devastating cuts to the services that people really want, particularly to colleges and universities. And they finally passed it, but there was a last-minute snafu, and you could hear Alario's voice being emotional as the clock has struck 6 p.m. The special session is now over, and he makes his remarks. And then he came walking down from the rostrum, and I was the first reporter to get to him. And I saw him as he was walking down on the marble steps onto the floor of the Senate. He had a handkerchief to his eyes. I mean, he some amount of tears had come out. And then when he spoke with me and the other reporters who then showed up, his eyes were very red. And he was very, very upset, both as Jerry mentioned, the 8 reconciliation bills coming all right at the end and them having to pass them without knowing what was in there, but also a sense of how close they came to not having the revenue and the deep cuts. Because John Alario is a Republican, but whose portrait did you see in his office when you went to visit him in West Vigo?
Bill Clinton.
Yeah, I think in the end
and meanwhile in the House, as Tyler's watching this, I'm on the House side, and the House Speaker adjourns sine die and takes the chamber off of the live broadcast and comes down and tells the floor that they should be proud of the work that they did. And then both Tyler and I and the rest of the press corps go up to the 4th floor where the governor walks out to applause from lawmakers and supporters. And I don't know if you saw that, he kind of looks over to him and it's kind of a quizzical look, like he's not sure they should be clapping.
Well, they were Democrats.
And he said it's not a great day for Louisiana. Was his.
Many lessons learned, do you think, that they are going to take with them and learn really quickly over these next 3 days before they have to go into regular session?
I hope so, because I do not want to have to go through another session like this. And 18 years of covering session, from my side, it was somewhat of an almost miserable experience, because just the lack of certainty in this session. And I think everyone who kind of works up the Capitol kind of went through the same thing, but just the lack of certainty of knowing what bills are going to come out and how things are coming together and trying to track it. You could have a deal in place at noon, and by 3:30 it was completely different.
Yeah, it had to have worn everybody out. We're going to get back to talk about the regular session in just a second. I'm going to wrap this discussion up, though. I'm going to go over to Steve right now because we want to also talk about some more money considerations, and this is regarding funding schools. Really, this is directed really just to schools in the city of New Orleans.
Right. This is
schools.
Orleans Parish charter schools, which are public schools. For the most part, education, K through 12 education, made it through the session fine. They've got the same amount of money that they had last year. But then how it gets doled out to each parish is what's at issue here. Last year, Dan Clater from Baton Rouge passed a bill that said money should be shifted around differently in Orleans Parish because there is no system that works together in the way a system should. They determined that more money was needed for special ed students than for gifted students. Most of the Recovery School District charter schools have a great number of special ed students. So the state has set up a tiered system where there are 5 different levels of special needs for the students, and they each come with a different price tag. At least that's what a working committee that was put together locally has come up with. Now, the state school board was supposed to vote on this. Bessie, everyone thought they were going to vote on this last week, and they got together, and I think at the last moment, I don't know if it was under threats from some of the schools that were going to lose out here in Orleans, but at the last minute they said, you know what, this really isn't our gig. We're going to pass it off to the folks down at the Orleans Parish School Board.
In terms of actually determining
shocked.
the amount of money, determining the formula.
Right.
Instead, Bessie said, we are talking about the policies involved.
Yeah,
here.
Bessie said we approve these 5 tiers. We approve the fact that English language learners should have a separate tier, or overage students. They define the categories, but they didn't put weight behind them. Because right now, under the current plan, a special ed student gets an extra $3,200 sent his way. Under the new plan, it'll range from $1,500 to $22,000. So, a huge range.
A big jump. And so that means that some monies that were going to the gifted programs are going to be shifted over, and that's making some folks unhappy.
Right. The schools that are usually seen as the top-rated public schools in the city, Ben Franklin High School, Lusher, Lake Forest, Audubon. The gifted and talented money right now is about $1,300 per student. Under the new formula, that would drop to almost a token of $375 per student. So that money would then be shifted to pay for. It's the same pot of money. So if they're getting a significant amount less,
they're shifting the monies around a little bit differently. And so these schools now say that they're going to sue because are they arguing that the Orleans School Board really does not have the right to make these financial determinations?
Right. Well, one of their main arguments is the Constitution calls for MFP, Minimum Foundation Program, to finance all the school districts at the same level. And they're saying, well, this is treating Orleans different. Orleans is saying that the superintendents of the Recovery School District and the Orleans Parish School Board superintendent say it's not treating us differently because the same amount of money is coming in. It's what we do with it once we get here.
When are decisions going to be made then about these monies and how they're going to be distributed?
Well, it's an excellent question that nobody knows. The bill that was passed said this has to go into effect by July 1st. Schools are on fiscal years that start July 1st, and their budget year begins then. The Orleans Parish School Board said, we don't think we have to do this, and I didn't understand it. They think it will go into law even if they do nothing. Which I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion.
Who makes the decisions about how the monies are spent?
Well, that's interesting. This schedule of money that came up with the 5 tiers was decided by a working group that they're called, so it wasn't called a committee, so in their eyes it wasn't open to the public records open meetings law. So this was a group of 12 people that met privately 5 times, that nobody knows what the decisions were, how they were arrived at, what the discussions were.
Oh my goodness, it seems like our discussion right now is it comes to, we don't know is the answer, because, thanks Steve, because now we're going to go back over and talk about the regular session, and it seems like we don't know how we're going to be plugging up an $800 million deficit for the next fiscal year.
Yeah, well, really, they're not going to be able to in the regular session. There'll be a special session, probably called right after. The governor's of the opinion that it would have to start on at least on June 7th. Doesn't the session end June 6th?
June 6th.
So that would give them roughly 3.5 weeks to patch a huge hole, and Does that sound familiar? We just went through a 3.5-week session so the regular session, the budget is still going to soak up a lot of the political thought and chatter, but there are enough education bills being filed right now that would suggest that the regular session could also be an education session. There's some TOPS reform bills that would go and grab some gaming proceeds and put it into the program, looking at the eligibility requirements, hiking up the GPA threshold. There are 3 bills already that would abolish the Board of Regents. Other boards that look at the university management systems and kind of pop the hood on their structural operations. And then you have a lot of issues that played out in 2015 that are going to be repeated in this session. There's a bill to prohibit public payrolls for being used for union dues. There's legislation that would prohibit lawmakers from continuing to give out scholarships to Tulane. And then there's those little bills that Tyler loves to cover, the state butterfly and I'm messing with you, Tyler. The official state butterfly. And then there's another bill that would make blaze pink, that hunters could wear blaze pink instead of hunter orange.
Is that what you prefer to wear, Jeremy?
Season.
Would you prefer the blaze pink as to orange? Does it matter?
I'll wear it. Yeah. If somebody takes me duck hunting, I'll put it on.
You put it on, huh?
But so, there's going to be a lot of distractions in the regular session from the budget, whereas in the special session, that was really the sole focus. So it's, bills are being filed now, and it convenes on Monday, and we'll be right back at it.
But for the regular session, they can't raise revenue.
They cannot.
They can
they can do fees. Mm-hmm. They can do fund sweeps. There's a few maneuvers they can do, but no new taxes and tax credits.
Which is why the expectation for another special session, that there's a lot of people out there who say, well, why can't they just cut it? And
this is the cutting session.
Remember, the last 8 years, there's been a Republican governor who favors less government, and the last 4 years, a totally Republican-controlled legislature, and yet I think they cut as deep as they could go, and the Republicans this year in the special session made a few more cuts, but there just doesn't seem to be very much more that can be cut.
Can they visit the issue of exemptions to businesses, tax exemptions to businesses? Is that something that can be handled, or do they have to wait just for the special session also?
Again, in odd years they can deal with the taxes, or they can do it in a special session, which is why they just had the special session, and which is why he and I are both being told, as other reporters are, that they're likely going to have to go into another special session when the regular session ends on June 6th.
So by the time they get to that second special session, they're going to really be an experienced legislature by then.
Really. Yeah.
Hopefully they'll be talking to one another, because we need for them to, that's for sure. Thanks, guys. Okay, quickly over to Errol now. We had a presidential primary in Louisiana last week.
On the surface, it wasn't a big surprise because Donald Trump won over Ted Cruz. There was no surprise at all that Hillary Clinton won on the Democratic side. But people kind of look at the numbers a little bit. While Trump won, he didn't win by that big of a margin. It was less than 4% that he won, which is a little bit different. So some people are wondering, is this the first sign of maybe the brakes coming down on Trump a little bit? If it is, we're going to find out next Tuesday, because if they don't come on, he could be on his way to the nomination. But it seems like the Trump support came from 3 factors. One, Orleans Parish Republicans are the people who live in the area of Orleans Parish, and so that'd be mostly Jefferson Parish and St. Tammany. The urban Republicans voted heavily for Trump. And the reason seems to be is that it was an anti-Jindal vote. Now, what does Trump have to do with Jindal? The same thing that Dave Vitter had to do with Jindal. I mean, he was associated as being part of the establishment and the way that things were. And so people that were angry because of Jindal, said, we don't want this whole crowd, we want somebody different. And so I think that Trump got a vote for that. Trump got a certain fundamentalist vote, which kind of surprises people. And he has been picking up some fundamentalist votes against Ted Cruz. The answer, I'm not sure, but Charles Krauthammer, I think, did a brilliant column last week where he said to the fundamentalists, and by no means can Donald Trump pass as being a fundamentalist. He can't be part of that crowd. But to them, he represents protection. They believe that their religion and their values are being threatened, and he believes he protect them. He used the example of the Romans protecting the Palestinians and that sort of thing. And so in that sense, they believe in him. And then I think there was a certain people that voted for Cruz just because he's next to Texas, and in Texas and in Oklahoma, he's done well. But it wasn't an overwhelming victory. But I guess, and in terms of delegates, that they split almost even on this.
And of course, Hillary won, and the Democrats.
Hillary won big, but that was no surprise. I mean, if someone's a moderate Democrat and if they're not crazy about Hillary, and they say, "Well, I got a choice between Hillary and Bernie Sanders," I think a lot of them said, "Where can I go but with Hillary?"
So March 15th is a really big day, and it could determine whether or not Trump has it or not, right?
It could possibly do that. It could certainly influence what happens to Rubio. I mean, all the feelings is that he's going to be dropping out of the campaign. There's some talk today actually about some of Rubio's people encouraging their voters to look at Kasich from Ohio and to try to get some momentum going behind him.
Well, he's really banking on Ohio to come out on top in Ohio. Any chance you think of a broker convention? Republican convention?
Well, we'll know after this week. I think it's a possibility, yeah. But, people talk about a broker convention as though there's some sort of illegal cabal. I mean, that's what conventions do. Mm-hmm. That's why you have conventions. And when people talk about, well, yeah, but the establishment's going to decide, well, that was always the case. I mean, it was the people that had the power and the authority who would ultimately make the decisions. The reforms we've seen over the years, to get the electorate involved, are fairly new, but for the longest time, conventions were that sort of thing, with people getting together and trying to, make political deals and make decisions. That's just the way the process worked.
All righty, Errol, it's time for us now to look ahead. Back to you.
There's a new PT boat that's being built by the World War II Museum, PT 305. It was an actual PT boat built by Higgins during the war, and the museum bought it in 2007. They've been doing a lot of work on it. When it's done, though, they're going to put it out. They're going to build a boathouse by the lake and have people actually be able to ride in this boat. And so it's really an exciting project. And they're in the last stage of raising money for it. But one day there'll be a PT boat back on Lake Pontchartrain.
All right, Jeremy.
On Monday, the governor will have been in office for 2 months, and he will give his second session opening speech. I'm curious to see if he's going to use it to try to mend some fences with lawmakers, or maybe browbeat them a little bit more.
Busy term for him so far, flooding up in North Louisiana, and all of this to handle too in Baton Rouge. Okay, thanks.
I'm excited for the special session as a drone enthusiast. I know there's a lot of drone bills and privacy. And I'm also looking forward to a couple weeks from now, the Lens will celebrate its 6th anniversary as being a nonprofit newsroom.
Congratulations,
so
that's great.
We're welcoming the public to our office on Earhart Boulevard to lift a glass and toast our good health.
And we can find you at?
thelensnola.org.
Very good. John.
Yeah, picking up what Jeremy said, I'm particularly interested to see what the Republicans in the House who wanted to have control, who were the ones who were always saying, let's make cuts, now facing this $800 million budget deficit, okay, what are they going to propose to actually make this level of cuts? Are they going to be serious, which they really weren't in the special session?
Okay, thanks a lot, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
Yeah.